It's more like longer. Oh, there's gigantic.
I just checked my mailbox and I had some, like a life-changing thing in there. It was got the most spicy chili. I'm so happy. I wondered if we won anything for that, and there's my answer. Right over my desk. Oh yeah, I put ghost peppers in it, but never to the point where I can't eat it. So I've made people cry, for real. It's a beautiful moment.
Yeah, I know, right?
I used to work for a guy at Iowa State that was from Poland, and he loved spicy stuff. And he told me, you know it's too spicy when it burns going in and coming out. I've never had that experience. I'm not really looking forward to it. So I always limit how hot I make something. Okay, we're on page 134. And if you already had lab, then you know that we've talked about some of 134 already. What was that? Hey, glasses, handy. Okay, so 134, we just finished talking about the 3 interactions you can have between hormones. If 2 hormones enhance each other, what are they called? Synergists. What if one shuts the other one off? What if one allows another one to move or work? Permissive. So we're going to talk about some of those different properties, and you always want to keep all of the sections we talked about on Tuesday in your mind. Those are all general rules or properties when it comes to hormones. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that when you talk about drugs, a lot of those same rules apply to drugs. There are drugs that can actually shut off or inhibit the effects of something in your body. What would they be called? Permissive, synergistic, or antagonists? Antagonists. There are some chemicals in your body, or drugs that you can take that enhance chemicals in your own body. What would they be? Synergists. Yep. And there aren't a lot of drugs that actually allow another one to work. The only one that comes to my mind would be with myasthenia gravis. What was that problem? Myasthenia gravis. It was where people had really weak muscles. What was the chemical that wasn't working properly at the neuromuscular junction? Acetylcholine. So you can take drugs that actually enhance or allow acetylcholine to work properly. So you can see that the drug concepts and hormone concepts actually overlap. What are the 2 major organs for clearing away drugs and hormones? Liver and kidney. Yep. What were the 3 major classes? One was amino acid based, but it was a long chain of amino acids. Peptide proteins. What was the one that was just a single amino acid? Amines. What was the other one? Steroids. What are steroids always made out of? Cholesterol. What was the name of the amino acid that the amines are made out of? Tyrosine. Yep. So remember those rules. Okay, so let's slide into the pineal gland. Pineal gland is kind of cool. When they originally started looking at it, the original neuroscientists back in the 1700s, when they were cutting apart the brain and trying to figure out what things were for, there was a guy that was really famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am," and he was brilliant. He looked at the pineal gland and says, this is the place where the soul is connected to the body. If you have a stroke or you have damage to this thing, your soul leaves your body, and suddenly you become this demon-like creature or whatever. But we've come a long way since then, and now we've found that the pineal gland is actually there primarily to regulate sleep. What's interesting is it's a little tiny gland right in the middle of your brain, and we don't really know everything it's there for. We just know sleep right now. And the chemical that you need to pay attention to is called melatonin. How many people have heard of this stuff before? It helps you regulate sleep. The way it works is kind of interesting. It's not based on like a negative feedback loop. It's actually based on a diurnal cycle. What's diurnal mean? Night and day. Yep, so light, dark cycles. When you look at this pathway, I think the pathway is really cool. So this is the eyeball. Here you have light coming into the eyeball. When the light stimulates these things at the back of the eye, what are these little things called that get stimulated by light? Rods and cones, photoreceptors. When these photoreceptors get stimulated, they send a pathway back here to this cross. What's the cross in the brain? The optic chiasm, the X, chi meaning X. So the optic chiasm, right above the optic chiasm, you have another special set of nerves that detects the activity at the chiasm. The more activity, what's probably in your environment? More dark or more light? More light. So the more activity that turns on, this pathway sends a signal up here to the pineal gland and shuts it off. What's the I word for shutting something off? Inhibits it, right. So it inhibits the pineal gland and prevents it from making melatonin. But as the sun goes down, what happens to the activity at the chiasm? It decreases. So what's going to happen to that inhibitory effect? It decreases too. So what's going to happen to the melatonin in your blood? It starts rising. It starts rising higher and higher and higher. What part of the brain is responsible for your awakeness? RAS, the reticular activating system, right? That's in the brain stem. So this melatonin goes down to the brain stem and it starts slowing down the reticular activating system. So you start getting that sleepiness, that tiredness. You start slipping from wide awake down into this sleepy, confused state, and then eventually lethargic, and you pass out. Hopefully you don't fall all the way into a coma, but it just like turns you down a little bit. And that's the melatonin working. If you get jet lag, if you're traveling from one part of the country to the other, when the light's a little bit different based on time, or your time, your internal clock, you can take melatonin and help reset that too. So we know some of the properties of melatonin. Let's see, I talked about the pathway, suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is the clock. What does suprachiasmatic tell you? Supra means above. What do you think that means by chiasmatic? Above the chiasm. Yep. So this nucleus are a bunch of cell bodies that sit right above the optic chiasm. They monitor the daylight cycles. So we call these things clock proteins. When it syncs with environmental cues, it's not just for sleep. It's primarily for sleep, but we find there's some other interesting effects. One effect is it works as an antioxidant. So these free radicals that get in your body that start aging you or start wearing down your organs, this melatonin goes and finds those things and neutralizes them. So when you get a lot of sleep and you have a lot of melatonin, when they say you're getting beauty sleep, they're actually kind of right because they're slowing down your aging process while you sleep. So antioxidants slows the aging. They also find that when you sleep, your immune system starts getting a little bit more active, and they think melatonin plays a big part in that. And another one I thought was really interesting is that this actually controls sex cycles, so reproductive cycles. In all animals, more so in outdoor animals than humans, but what they find is that in the wintertime, what's happening to the light? More of it or less of it than summer? A lot less. So there's going to be more or less melatonin in your blood. More melatonin. In animals that live outside, they find that melatonin actually slows down their reproductive cycles. So they're less likely to get pregnant and to have her. Is it the right word, pregnant, when you're talking about a quadruped? They're less likely to, get pregnant. I can't think of a better word. And have offspring during that time. So it's evolutionarily it's an advantage because then they don't have babies or whatever you call the quadruped things, pups, whatever, in the wintertime when they're more likely to die. So it's kind of a cool function. And I've heard that they're experimenting with humans, but I haven't heard the results yet to see if they can use melatonin as a contraceptive. And I'm thinking if they use that as a contraceptive, what's melatonin do? It makes you sleep. Yeah, you sleep all the time. There's no time for sex, right? So it's got to work, at least in that fashion. Okay, so the pineal gland. Now moving on to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Actually, anterior and posterior pituitary. All of these organs we're talking about right now are in the brain, so what would they be considered, peripheral or central? They're central. Pineal gland is the first of the central, hypothalamus is the next, anterior pituitary, and the pituitary are the four we're going to talk about for central. So the hypothalamus, I can't remember if your textbook does this or not, but a lot of textbooks out there call the anterior pituitary the master pituitary gland, or master gland. The hypothalamus to me is the master. The pituitary gland does nothing at all without the hypothalamus telling it what to do. So who's the master? The hypothalamus. It has to be telling the pituitary what to do. The hypothalamus, you already know, are for 4S, freezing, feeding, fighting, fornicating, and it helps work through endocrine functions to balance those things out. And we talked about some of the hormones when we were talking about feeding instincts. What was the name of the hormone that comes from fat cells to try and stop you from eating? Leptin. Yep. And then we talked about those orexins that make you hungry. Those are all hormones. Right? And those are happening in the hypothalamus. So leptin goes up to the hypothalamus, orexins are produced in the hypothalamus, and they're hormones that help regulate your feeding. Okay? Your freezing, we'll talk, actually we already talked briefly. What was one hormone that increases your metabolism? Thyroid hormone. So hypothalamus indirectly affects the thyroid. The hypothalamus affects the anterior pituitary that then goes on to affect the thyroid. So there's your feeding or feeding or we've got feeding and freezing. I'll just take them one at a time instead of making my own word. Feeding. I always feed when I eat too much. Right? And I think I'm just going to skip and go to the pictures. But here you have the hypothalamus, and what's this thing the hypothalamus sits underneath? I'll give you a hint. Look at the name hypothalamus, right? Sits underneath the thalamus. What was the thalamus for? Which is the structure up here. It was the relay center. It took all the sensations from the outside of your body, so vision, sound, everything from the outside, and it helps relay it up to the cortex. What was the cortex responsible for? Conscious thought, or conscious awareness. Okay, so the hypothalamus now is going to start sending a signal down here and controlling the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is controlled by a group of hormones that we're going to talk about. The posterior pituitary is actually connected to the hypothalamus by neurons. So there's a big difference between how these two structures are connected to the hypothalamus. So the anterior pituitary is connected by blood passageways. Posterior pituitary is connected by neural passageways. So the first of the two. Pituitary we call the hypophysis. The anterior pituitary is called the adenohypophysis. It's a true endocrine gland. It comes from connective tissue. So adeno. Where it develops is a place called Rathke's pouch, which grows from the mouth up. So this part of the brain is actually originating in the mouth and moves its way up into the brain. So is it going to be more like brain tissue or other body tissues? Other body tissues. And that's what helped me remember that it's not connected by neural passageways to the hypothalamus. It's connected by bloodstream. And that bloodstream connection is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. It tells you where it starts and it tells you where it goes. Where does it start? Hypothalamus. Where does it go? Look at that word hypophyseal. Look familiar? It goes to the pituitary. So it's a portal system. Just like when we talked about the hepatic portal system, it carries blood to the liver. The hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system carries blood from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary. So here's your passageway from your book. Here I have some neurons that are up in the hypothalamus. They dump chemicals into the blood. They're neurons that dump chemicals into the blood. Once they dump it into the blood, what are those chemicals called? Hormones. If you want to be really specific, it's a neurohormone, but it's still a hormone. So it goes through blood flow down through that hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system all the way down to the anterior pituitary. Once it's down here, what are those hormones looking for? A hormone always has to find a receptor. Yep. So they're looking for receptors. They have specific receptors for each of those hormones on the anterior pituitary. Once they get down here, they find the receptor. These cells are waiting. They've got this product stocked up. They're storing this next hormone, just waiting for it. As soon as that chemical, that hormone, hits the receptor, it dumps out a second hormone. What was the first hormone called then? Starts with a T. Tropic. Yep, it was a tropic hormone. All these hormones we're talking about from the hypothalamus that come down to the anterior pituitary, they're all tropic hormones. They come down here, they find a second cell, and that cell dumps out another hormone. Let's see how much concept you remember. So this already has the product made and stored inside. These second hormones are already there. They're waiting. They're sitting under the heat lamp, waiting for something to happen. These hormones that come down from the hypothalamus bind to a receptor. Where's the receptor at? Inside or outside the cell? It's outside the cell, right? Everything's already pre-made. You know, this hormone has to be what? Hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Hydrophilic. It's water-loving. Can it go in the cell and make something new? Nope. It goes to the outside of the cell, flips a trigger, and then that product that's already made gets dumped out into the blood. Once it's dumped in the blood, where does it go? Everywhere. It goes everywhere in your body. What's it looking for? Receptors. So it's looking for a target cell that has a specific receptor on it. One more question to see how much you remember. So if these are all hydrophilic hormones, what are they probably made out of? Proteins or one single amino acid. Yep, so they're either going to be protein-based or one single amino acid. They're always hydrophilic, and all of these, I'm going to make life simple, they're all protein-based. When we talked about the amino acid that loves water, we mentioned catecholamines. Does anybody remember what the name of the catecholamines were? I'll give you a hint. They're located in the adrenal gland. What's the first chemical that pops in your mind when you think adrenal gland? Adrenaline. What's the technical name for it? Epinephrine. What's the other chemical that's just like epinephrine, or very closely associated? Norepinephrine. Anybody remember what the precursor for norepinephrine is? I'll give you a hint. Parkinson's people have a problem making this stuff. Dopamine. Yep, those are the three catecholamines: epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Right? So you want to think the hypothalamus is releasing these proteins because all of the amine catecholamines, they're all made in the adrenal gland. All right, and then the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary has neural signals coming from down here all the way down that stalk. When it gets to the posterior pituitary, it stores. It just holds on to those neurotransmitters right here. When you're ready to release these things, the hypothalamus sends a neural signal all the way down the axon. I swear it makes that sound. And when it gets down to the end of the axon, it dumps the neurotransmitter into the blood. Now what is it? It's a hormone. Now it becomes a hormone. It's traveling all over the place. Where are these hormones made? Are they made in the posterior pituitary or the hypothalamus? The hypothalamus. And that's kind of a key, too. Everything that's released from the posterior pituitary is not made in the posterior pituitary. So you have two special chemicals we're going to talk about, and there are two special types of neurons that release these chemicals. Okay. These first ones, the paraventricular nucleus, these things release oxytocin. The ones in the supraoptic nucleus, they release vasopressin. The only way I really remember it is I look at the letters. P and O are closely related, so paraventricular and oxytocin. It's a pretty technical trick, very medical based. But if that helps you remember the type of the neurons, that works for me. Okay, so hypothalamus makes them, posterior pituitary just stores them. Okay, next the chemicals are the hormones you have to absolutely positively know by heart. And after using my Scrabble prowess and rearranging letters and scrambling things and trying to figure out what the best way to remember this is, I came up with flat pig. So here's a flat pig. The 6 hormones you need to remember for the anterior pituitary are FSH, LH, ACTH, TSH, prolactin, and growth hormone. So the only thing you're missing is the I in pig. But you have to know those. You have to know where they come from. We're going to talk about what stimulates their release. You have to know where they go and what they're trying to do and their final physiological effect. So if you've had lab this week, you know that we spent almost the entire time in lab putting together these pathways. You have to know them. And I'll help you put some together here in lecture too. Okay, so those are the ones you absolutely positively have to know. So based on what I've told you so far, the general principles of what happens between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, which of these things is true? How about number 4? Can they be stored?
Yes.
Yes, they can. Remember, they're sitting inside under the heat lamp just waiting, so you know they can be stored. How about number 3? Are they synthesized on demand?
No.
Nope. Because they're sitting there stored. How about number 1? Did I just give away what the answer was? But number 1, they're hydrophobic. What do you know about them? They're hydrophilic. And then how about they're made from bigger molecules? How do you know that's true? Because they're made out of what? Protein peptides. And in your notes it said protein peptides always start as a pro hormone, then they get cleaved down to a pro-hormone, then they get clipped down to a smaller hormone, which is the active hormone. So they're always made as a bigger molecule and cleaved down. Number 2 is the right answer. Ooh, look how tough that one was. Okay, so here's some examples of how your book puts together the pathways. And it draws a picture coming from the anterior pituitary. The only thing you really have to add on to this would be their final response. So you want to elaborate just a little bit more. And you also want to put down the initiating stimuli. So for something that's coming from the anterior pituitary, where is the initial stimuli or initiating stimuli always coming from? The hypothalamus. It's always coming from the hypothalamus. And then you want to figure out what causes the hypothalamus to release this thing. In most of the cases, if you look at the physiological effect, like we'll take metabolic rate. If metabolic rate is the final physiological effect, metabolic rate going up, temperature going up, what was probably the initial stimuli? A drop in metabolic rate or a drop in temperature. So look at the physiological effect and ask yourself, well, if this is what the outcome is, the initial stimuli based on negative feedback loops means it must be exactly the opposite thing that started it off. So when you look at the different ones, remember the flat pigs with TSH. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, you want to remember the full name because it tells you exactly what it does. What's it going to do? It goes to the thyroid and stimulates the thyroid. Thyroid releases new hormones. So what is this? Tropic or non-tropic? It's tropic. If this comes to the thyroid and causes it to release more hormones, this is trophic. Right? This goes to the cells in the body, all the cells in the body, and increases their metabolic rate. Is that a tropic or non-tropic hormone? It's non-tropic. It gives it a physiological effect. You can measure temperature change. You can determine calorie burning. Right. This one gets a little bit split, and when we get into growth hormone, we'll talk about it in better detail. But growth hormone itself goes down to the liver. It also goes straight to the bone tissue and soft tissues like muscle. But growth hormone, it does two things. It goes to the liver and releases this somatomedin, which is a hormone. So what is growth hormone? It's tropic there. Over here, it goes straight to the tissue and causes the tissues to turn up the metabolic rate, produce more muscle, as an example. Would that be a physiological or a tropic effect? It's a physiological. So growth hormone actually has both properties depending on where it's going. It can be tropic in this pathway, non-tropic in that one. That's why sometimes it gets a little sticky, but in your notes it's all pointed out. And then the gonadotropins, obviously what are they going to affect finally? The gonads, right? So they come from the anterior pituitary. There are two of them. They go all the way down to the gonads, whether it's a male or female. We both release LH and FSH. And then in men, I always look at FSH and think what? Fish, little sperm, right? So I think of the little minnows swimming around. But FSH goes down to the testis and increases sperm production. So what must it do in a woman? It's comparable. Helps develop a what? An egg. Yep. So it helps develop the egg so that she can ovulate. And then LH comes down to the testis and produces what hormone? Testosterone. So it's going to come down to the ovary and it's going to help her increase production of what two hormones? Estrogen and progesterone. This is also going to help her ovulate. And we'll get to that when we get to the reproduction. That's the big picture of those different hormones. Right. The next two sections, I think it's letter C and letter D in your notes. You need to know these and have to put in a pathway. And like I said, in lab, we're going to put them into pathways. So you always want to be familiar with what's the name of the stimulating factor, so what caused it to be released, where's it going, what are the name of the cells, what's the physiological effect. And if you look in the book, most of these are named after the cell they're released from. So the hypothalamic hormones like thyrotropin releasing hormone, what's its job? Stimulate the pathway for the thyroid, right? So it's a hypothalamic hormone. It's not going to go straight to the thyroid. It's going to take a medium step at what location? The anterior pituitary. Yep, it goes to the anterior pituitary, stimulates something called a thyrotrope, which is the name of the cell. That thyrotrope releases one of those hormones in letter C. What hormone would it release? TSH. So a lot of these, they tell you exactly what they're doing. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone goes down and releases thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid and stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones. How about corticotropin-releasing hormone? Where would that go? Anterior pituitary again, and stimulate the release of which of those anterior pituitary hormones? ACTH. Corticotropin, it looks like the word adrenocortico. So use that to help you connect. Gonadotropin, what two hormones will that release? FSH and LH, the gonadotropes. How about growth hormone releasing hormone? This one gets a little sticky. It stimulates the release of growth hormone. And then growth hormone inhibiting hormone is just the opposite. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone has a fancy name called somatostatin. Have you heard of it before? Yeah. What's it do? Stops everything. Guess what it does to growth hormone? It inhibits it. It stops it. Just like everything else we learned when we were talking about the GI tract, somatostatin likes to stop everything it comes in contact with. Right. And then the last two, prolactin-releasing hormone and prolactin-inhibiting hormone. Obviously, they work on prolactin. Prolactin-releasing hormone releases prolactin. Take a guess what prolactin does. It promotes lactation. Yep, it promotes milk production. This other chemical, prolactin-inhibiting hormone, stops that process. This has another name. It's dopamine. Okay, so definitely know your feedbacks. And I went through these feedback loops the other day with you, the long, the short, the ultra short, and the long, and positive. The long loop negative feedback, remember, it starts in the brain, sends a signal all the way out to the periphery somewhere. Its final destination is in the periphery, and the final response from the periphery goes all the way back up to the brain and tells the brain stop or reverse. So that's long. Starts at the brain, goes to the periphery, and comes all the way back. The next one starts in the brain. It goes to the brain, just next door, from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and then that signal from the anterior pituitary goes back to the hypothalamus, who shuts it off or reverses it. So that would be short. It's a short distance. It stays in the brain, starts in the brain, stays in the brain, never leaves the brain. Ultra short means that the source that releases that chemical actually shuts itself off. What source am I talking about? Hypothalamus. Hypothalamus releases a hormone to stimulate the anterior pituitary, but that gets in your blood too, and the hypothalamus goes, whoa, maybe I just released a little bit too much, and then it shuts itself off. It's an ultra short loop. What makes long loop positive completely different than all three of these others? It turns up. It enhances whatever the initial stimuli was. So when did I tell you there are 2 times you're going to have to remember the positive feedback pathways? Childbirth and menstruation. Yeah. So the menstrual cycle and childbirth. What was the name of the chemical I told you for childbirth? Do you remember? Yep, oxytocin. So oxytocin, as it starts flowing into the blood, it causes uterine contractions. Uterine contractions send a neural signal to the brain saying, release more oxytocin. Well, oxytocin just caused this thing, so now it's going to just keep piling up the oxytocin in the woman's blood. What happens to her contractions? More intense and more frequent. Something dramatic, something intense has to happen to stop positive feedback loop. And then if you like drawing pictures the way the book does, they put lots and lots of boxes. I'm not a huge fan of lots of boxes. I told you put boxes around what? Just the organ or gland, right? And then the arrows represent the bloodstream, and then the hormones go right next to the bloodstream because that's where they're traveling. So you can have a lot of different types of input. Some can be neural input. You can think yourself into releasing hormones. Not like release more thyroid hormone, but you can get stressed out, you can get high anxiety, you can get depressed, and it starts adjusting the way you release hormones. Or it can be a hormonal input. So you can have one hormone affecting another one. Or it can be a feedback loop for hormones. You release way too much testosterone, it goes back to the brain and says stop releasing testosterone. You take artificial testosterone, it goes back to the brain and says, whoops, there's too much out there, stop making it. Right. So this is why those pathways are important. Think about this a second. And if there's a tumor in the thyroid gland that's producing thyroid hormone in excess, what's the name of the disorder right now? Hyperthyroidism, right? So too much thyroid hormone. Before I go any further, what was the effect of thyroid hormone? What does it do to you? Increases your metabolism. So if you have too much thyroid hormone, what's going to happen to this person? Really thin. They're going to have really high metabolism. What about their body temperature? Really high. So some of those things should start popping in your head as soon as you see thyroid hormone and then hyperthyroid hormone. So if they're making way too much thyroid hormone, what would you expect the levels of TRH and TSH to be? So why would you think low? If the thyroid hormone or thyroid gland is broken, it's making too much T3 and T4. What's the T3 and T4 going to do to that loop? It's going to turn it up or down? Down. It turns it down. It shuts off the hypothalamus. So what's going to happen to your production of TRH? It goes down. If you don't have TRH, what happens to the anterior pituitary's release of TSH? It also goes down. So they both drop as a result. And that's one of the ways that they can distinguish what's wrong with you by taking a blood sample. So if you have hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism and they take a blood test, they look for T3, T4, and TSH. And then they can determine kind of where the problem's at. If it's in the thyroid, they can isolate it. So if you have hypothyroidism, which means you're making way too little T3 and T4, but your blood samples come back high for TSH, where's your problem? At the thyroid itself. So just looking at those pathways, they can determine what your problem is. Okay, so now disorder times. Pan-hypopituitarism. Pan means all-encompassing. Hypo means what? Low, and then the pituitary is saying the pituitary gland. So decreased secretion of all of the anterior pituitary hormones. So if I tell you that growth hormones obviously to help you do what? It's to help you grow big and strong. If you have hypo growth hormone release, what's going to happen to you? You're not going to grow very big. If I tell you that this is taking care of the gonadotropes, LH and FSH, what's going to happen to your reproductive ability? Decrease. What's going to happen to your secondary sex characteristics because of that? Decrease. Why would it decrease secondary sex characteristics? What hormones causing you to release those other hormones that make you more masculine or feminine? So you're right, with estrogen and testosterone, the two chemicals I'm talking about secondarily, what's the one from the anterior pituitary that's releasing both of those? LH. Yep. So you see a decrease in reproductive ability, you see a decrease in secondary sex characteristics. What am I forgetting? Ooh, ACTH, where did that go? What's the name, actually? Adrenal, so where's it going? Adrenal gland. Cortical, what part of the adrenal gland? Cortex, and it's decreasing production of the adrenal cortex hormones, which we haven't talked about yet, but one of them is cortisol. What's going to happen to their ability to deal with stress? It's going to drop too. So let me remember. Flat pig, FSH, LH, we already talked about ACTH. They're not going to release thyroid hormone in appropriate amounts, so what's going to happen to their body temperature? Drops. What's going to happen to their body weight? Probably go up. Yep. And then prolactin, unless they're breastfeeding, they're probably not going to have a big problem with that one. So now that I've just given you the answer, basically, a newborn presents with panhypopituitarism. Which of the following symptoms would she most likely have if left untreated? So would she have high metabolic rate? Why would she not have high metabolic rate? Because she's missing thyroid hormone, right? How about gigantism? No. Not going to have that because she's missing growth hormone. Failure of reproductive development and function?
Yes.
Yes. When you have stress, what happens to your blood pressure? It goes up. Is she going to have any issues with stress? No, she's not going to be able to deal with stress very well. So when you lack cortisol, cortisol actually decreases your blood pressure. Why did you want high blood pressure when you're in a stressful situation? What's it trying to do for you? There's actually a benefit when it's short term. We talked about it in cardiovascular. It's going to increase the flow to your brain. What's it carrying to your brain? Glucose. What's that going to do for your brain? Help you think better. What's it going to do for your stressful situation? Help you get out of it, right? Okay. So next issues. Endocrine growth or control of growth. It's continuous all the time. And we're not talking about growing taller and taller and taller. Obviously, there's a limit to where you're going to grow as far as height. But when you're growing, you're continuously making new proteins. You're always breaking down your muscle. You're always breaking down the collagen in your bones. You're reforming that stuff. It's a constant process. When are you going to need this growth hormone the most? The most is going to be from the time you're born until you're about 21 years old, when what stops? Yeah, growth stops. When what stops? Puberty, when puberty ends. We still need growth hormone after puberty because we're constantly developing new muscle. We're constantly building muscle and building our bones. So in the later years, if you start decreasing your growth hormone, what physical characteristics is going to affect you after puberty? You can't maintain bone mass, bone density, or muscle mass, muscle density. What happens to your muscles when that happens? They turn to fat, like the rest of us. Right? So growth means continuous protein synthesis. The growth periods you need to be familiar with are from 0 to 2. So right after you're born, you have this spike, 0 to 2 years of age, and then do you stop growing? No, it just slows down. So you have the spike for about the first 2 years, and then you start slowly growing. It slows up down a little bit until when? Puberty, and then poof, another spike. And of course, for puberty, girls get it a little bit earlier. I don't know if I agree with the whole maturing thing earlier, but they hit puberty. Yeah, whatever. So here's your growth spurts. 0 to 2, and then it kind of slows down. It doesn't stop, it just slows down a little bit, and then puberty hits, and you have this massive growth spurt until you're about 20 or 21 years old, and then it slows down again. And your height, does it go any taller after 21? No. Okay, what determines growth? Right, exactly. Not up, out. So genetics are a primary determinant. Genetics put a cap, like a maximum on where you should be able to grow. There are a lot of other factors that determine whether you're going to hit that height. It's just like a plant. A plant's genetics may want it to grow really, really tall, but its environment may change it. Like bonsai trees. Bonsai trees are meant to grow really tall, but what do they do to them? They put them in a little tiny pot, and it limits their growth. People are the same way. If you have good genetics to make you big and strong, but you don't feed them the right food, then they're not going to grow big and strong. So diet's really important. Getting the right nutrients, the right vitamins, minerals, proteins, carbs, fats, everything. Right. Another factor is being free from chronic diseases. So things like endocrine disorders. What endocrine disorder would definitely stunt your growth if you don't release growth hormone appropriately? That's one of them. We'll talk about a couple of them later, but that's one very clear one. Normal levels of growth influencing hormones like thyroid hormone, which is another one we're going to be talking about. The thyroid hormone is permissive with growth hormone. What's that tell you? It allows growth hormone to work. So if you have plenty of growth hormone in your body, but you don't have enough thyroid, what would happen to you? You still would be short. So there are over 250 types of dwarfism. And it's all kinds of factors coming into play. It's not just growth hormone. It's not just the pituitary gland. It could be all kinds of different factors. Thyroid hormone is one of them. Okay, insulin. Insulin helps you grow. Insulin is known as a synthetic or anabolic hormone. When you hear the word anabolic, what usually pops in your mind? Steroids, right? Anabolic steroids that help people get big and strong. Insulin is considered an anabolic hormone because it helps you synthesize proteins. It helps you build bigger muscles. It helps you store sugar. It's all about saving things and building you. And then the sex hormones. What two sex hormones we're talking about with puberty? Estrogen and testosterone. So there are a lot of factors going into growing the right size. Okay, so growth hormones actions. What growth hormone does is it stimulates bone growth taller until what part of the bone seals shut? Yeah. I love it when people try to say it. It's a tough word. Epiphyseal plate, right? So when the epiphyseal plate seals shut, the bone can't grow any longer anymore. It stops growing in height. Does that mean the bone can't grow anymore? No, your bones are dynamic. They're constantly changing. They're always breaking themselves down and rebuilding themselves. The problem is that if you overstimulate them to grow, they won't grow taller. They will grow more round, exactly, more wide. And this becomes a problem when you look at places like flat bones on the forehead, or the skull in general, and the jaw. There's not a lot of room for growth. Everything's there for a purpose, and it's a nice tight fit. You start growing or thickening bones there, you start causing mental problems. Okay, so growth hormones effects on three things: the proteins, the fats, and the carbs. When you're looking at the proteins, growth hormone stimulates growth. So what's it going to do to your proteins in your body? Stick them together and build muscle, or rip your muscle apart? It's going to build them. It has an anabolic effect on muscle. A couple of years ago, Sylvester Stallone got busted with artificial human growth hormone when he was going to China or something like that. Because when we hit our 30s, our growth hormone starts going downhill, and he's, what, like 60 now? And so for him to help maintain his muscle mass, he was taking artificial growth hormone. I guess that's one way of saying you don't do steroids. Just do it in a different way. And then on fat, it helps you break down fat. So what's it do to your adipose tissue? It breaks it apart. Why would it break apart your fat? What's it doing with that fat? It's using it for energy. Right, it wants to build muscle, so it needs some energy source to build the muscle, so it breaks down the fat for energy. And then carbs, it increases blood glucose. So what's it do? Does it store sugar or release sugar? It releases it. Why would it release sugar into your blood? See the last point? Energy again. So it's trying to release the sugar into your blood so you have energy. It's anabolic when it comes to protein synthesis. It's trying to build muscle, but it's catabolic, which means it destroys it when you're talking about triglycerides and sugars. What's the storage form of sugar that it's trying to break down? Glycogen. And then I already mentioned this, that growth hormone's effect on bones increases long bone length, thickness. So here's how it works. There you have the long bone, there's their epiphyseal plate. So growth hormone comes cruising along. Growth hormone cruises along with the sex hormone. So in men, what's going to come along and stimulate this? Testosterone. So during puberty, what happens is growth hormone, testosterone both crank up. They come over here. They start stimulating this plate to start growing. And this plate starts growing up, 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 up. It lengthens the shaft of the bone. So the diaphysis starts getting longer and longer and longer. The epiphysis stays about the same length until that plate seals shut. So if you looked at it, you start building down here, and you start adding and adding and adding. So you have stem cells, and you start turning those stem cells into firm, dense bone tissue. And just keep adding on and adding on and adding on. Growth hormone doesn't like to work alone. We already said it likes to work with what other chemical on that last slide? Testosterone. I mentioned earlier it likes to work with another chemical that's released because of sugar, insulin, and then now there's another one called somatomedins. Somato means the body. These are mediators of the body growth. So they're also known as insulin-like growth factors. Insulin-like because their structure looks a lot like insulin, but they're not the same. So they just call them IGFs for short. And there are two of them. Okay, so IGF-1 increases the linear bone growth, and then IGF-2, we only see high levels of that before you're even born. So they think that it has a couple roles. It has one role of lengthening the bones, but it also has a role of taking the bones from hyaline cartilage, which are flexible and kind of transparent, and turning them into bone. So IGF-2 is more important before birth. And then IGF-1 starts cranking out at what time of your life? Take a guess. When you get a lot of linear bone growth. Puberty. Right. Where somatomedins come from is the liver. So remember, you want to know the organ that these things originate in. What stimulates their release is what other hormone? Bink. What have we been talking about? Growth hormone. So you want to know that pathway. And I'll flip over and help you put together a pathway real quick. Actually, I think it's in your notes, isn't it? Right there. Yep. So you want to get handy at drawing these paths like that. I don't know if your notes has a box around hypothalamus, but remember, I put the organs in boxes. I put the hormones next to the bloodstream. So when you look at this, over the next couple slides, you're going to plug in information. This is your basic skeleton flow chart. You have the hypothalamus releasing GHRH, which is growth hormone releasing hormone that excites the anterior pituitary. So it goes to something called a somatotrope in the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates release of growth hormone. Growth hormone goes two directions. One direction is going straight to the liver to release what chemicals? Those somatomedins, those IGFs. The other pathway is it's going to go over here to all the other cells in your body, primarily muscle, bone, and soft tissues like connective tissue. What's it going to do to all of those? Increase growth. So it increases synthesis. So it helps you grow bones, help you grow muscles, help you grow the connective tissue in between the muscle and the bone. Right. You can actually draw a little arrow from the somatomedins over here at every cell too, because the somatomedins will go to those cells and help them. So they work with the growth hormone to increase muscle density, bone density, and connective tissue. Right. Up here, this is in the little blocks or the parentheses because it's growth hormone inhibiting. It's just doing the exact opposite effect. It's the same flow chart. The only difference is growth hormone inhibiting does what to this flow? Stops it. So if you stop this, you stop everything downstream of it. Why is this saying SS here? What did I tell you the other name for GHIH is? Somatostatin, which likes to do what to your body? Stop it. I stop it. Right? So above the hypothalamus, now you want to know what stimulates this. It works on a negative feedback loop for one thing. High levels of growth hormone will actually inhibit releasing more growth hormone. So the negative feedback loop. High levels of growth hormone can inhibit growth hormone release. When your levels of growth hormone start spiking or right after you fall asleep. Shaquille O'Neal, he was asked one time why they thought he grew so big, and he said because he gets lots of sleep. It's kind of right. So lots of sleep enhances your growth. So if you're exercising really hard and you're trying to put on muscle mass and get big and strong, does it help if you're only sleeping 4 hours a night? No. You need to get sleep so you can release the growth hormone. Right? And then you definitely want to have these 3 little stars here. So these are stimulators. Hypoglycemia, what's that mean? Low blood sugar. If your blood sugar drops, do you remember what one of the final effects of growth hormone was? Look in your notes, just a little bit backwards. Is to break down glycogen and release it into the blood as glucose. So if the stimulator is hypoglycemia, one of the final effects has got to be a raise in blood sugar. And when you have this hypoglycemia, the 2 times that it primarily pops out are when you're exercising or after stressful events. So the stress, what organ in the body is stealing all that sugar during stress? The brain. So after your stressful event, your blood sugars have dropped, you're plummeted. How do you feel after a stressful situation? I just need to take a damn nap. This was too much, right? It's because your blood sugars are dropping so fast because your brain's been using all that sugar. So growth hormone will come out, take the nap. It helps enhance everything. And then exercise. Why did this drop your blood sugar? Because the muscles are stealing it, right? So the muscles are taking all that sugar and they're burning it up really fast. By the way, what's the growth hormone going to do to the muscle after exercise? It's going to build it up. Yep. So if you have high amino acids, if you have an abundance of amino acids in your blood, growth hormone says, whoa, that's a lot of amino acid. We need to do something with it. What do you do with free amino acids? You want to build proteins out of them. The first thing you want to do is start building proteins. Growth hormone tries to build proteins where in your body? Where do you have an abundance of, muscle. Where you have an abundance of proteins in the muscle. What do you think you do with all the extra that the muscle doesn't need? If the muscle says, I haven't been used, so I really don't need the protein, send it somewhere else. If all the muscles are saying we're good, what do you think that amino acid gets turned into? It's turned into fat, right? So is it good to be on a high protein diet if you're not exercising regularly too? No, because then you're just going to keep putting on calories and putting on pounds anyway. And then the third one, decrease free fatty acid levels. If your fatty acid levels drop, growth hormone comes out, and what's it do to your adipose tissue? Breaks it down. So another part of a good diet plan would be to get a good night's sleep. Because when growth hormone comes out, what's it doing to your fat cells? It's breaking them down. It's releasing energy into the blood so that you have energy for later. If you look, all of these 3 things were stimulators: low sugar, high amino acids, low fats. If you look back here, look at what the final results are. Protein synthesis. It lowers your blood amino acids. Breaking down fats to release it into the blood. It raises your blood fats. And breaking down sugar to release it into the blood. It raises your blood sugar. All 3 of these are exactly the opposite of the stimuli. Like I said, it saves some memorization if you just understand the principles that usually come along with endocrine system. There are always exceptions to the rule, but it's easier to remember the exceptions and not every single detail. So if you're asked a question like this, which one is not a function of growth hormone? So does it increase muscle mass?
Yes.
Yep. Does it increase your blood sugar?
Yes.
Yep. Does it stimulate your bone growth? Yep. So does it break down fat?
Break down fat.
Or sorry, I said break down fat. Does it increase fat tissue? No, it does break down fat, right? So the right answer here is number 3. I'm just giving you a heads up. You have to know, I've said this I think 3 times already today, you have to know where the hormone's coming from, what stimulates its release, what its final action is, and you have to know those cold. You have to. So however creative ways you can come up with to do that is best, because I'm telling you up front, the first page on the next exam have 23 hormones that you have to know those things. It's the first page. It's a really thin test because there aren't very many pages, but the sucky thing is that the first page is a lot of matching where you have to know where things come from, what they do, and what stimulates their release. All right. So here's just a modified version of that flowchart that's already in your book. You can see things like exercise and stress and a drop in blood glucose enhance hypothalamic activity. So when it turns up that hypothalamic activity, it releases, other way. What did I do here? Enhances hypothalamic. Why are there 2 pluses up there? Here. They both do that. So it goes over here. If you see in your book, this pathway should cut out across like this. The only thing that flips on this side are these 2 things. So the pluses over here come over to this side. They increase growth hormone releasing hormone. goes to the anterior pituitary, releases what hormone? Growth hormone. Growth hormone goes to two special sections of the body. What's the main organ it's going to want to go to? Liver. And do what? Stimulate the release of somatomedins. And they're going to help mediate body growth. There's another thing the liver is going to do. What's the liver storing that growth hormone is going to make it release? Sugar. Yep. So it's also going to help it break down sugar. It's going to split apart the glycogen and turn it into glucose again. Right? And then when it goes to the other cells of the body, like adipose tissue, it breaks the adipose down. When it goes to the muscle cells, it builds them up. And bone cells increases bone growth. And then diurnal rhythm, what's that mean? Day-night. And I wish it would be a little bit more specific because it's not necessarily just day-night. It revolves around you doing what? Sleeping. Right. When you break your growth hormone, one of the problems? Dwarfism. So in children, if you have what? Hyper or hypo release of growth hormone? Hypo. If you decrease your growth hormone release, they don't get big and tall. Dwarfism. As an adult, if you don't have much growth hormone, there aren't a lot of symptoms. But what was one symptom you're going to notice that slowly starts progressing? They get fatter, right? If the growth hormone is not there to break down fat, they just accumulate more fat. And it's also not going to let them do what? Build what? Muscle and bone efficiently. So it's just one of those signs of aging. So these two kids are the same age. It's an example of dwarfism. These two kids are the same age. I'm guessing this is in May of 1968. That or her name's May 68. Right? Just the opposite, what would this be? Hypo or hyper? Hyper, making too much. So in kids, what plate hasn't sealed yet? Epiphyseal. You've been practicing. So the epiphyseal plate hasn't sealed, so they can keep getting taller and taller and taller and taller. That's gigantism. After the epiphyseal plate seals, they can still have the same problem, but they no longer grow taller. What happens to their bones? They get wider. So things like their hands start broadening out. Their jaw starts jutting forward because their flat bones, their irregular bones, start increasing in thickness. The bones in their head, like the forehead, you'll notice they start looking a little bit more, lack of a better word, caveman-like. Their forehead starts projecting forward a little bit more, protruding. These two kids are the same age? I'm kidding. Just testing you. But yeah, she has gigantism. This guy, this is a cool article, 8 feet 4 inches tall from Ukraine. He considered his height being a curse from God because it took him almost 3 months to save up for one pair of shoes. It's insane. And of course, you probably heard my joke already. This is photoshopped from 1902. Back in the good old days when Photoshop was in its early years. And this is an example of acromegaly. So you can see that she has kind of a jutting forward, the head, really pronounced forehead. Her jaw is starting to move forward. Somebody asked if Jay Leno had this problem, and I have no idea. Okay, this guy also has acromegaly. And this is interesting because I kept thinking, well, he looks just fine. He just looks really tall. But when you look at his height, he's like 5'7", and then with that little toupee, 5'8". So he just has a really large face and forehead, abnormally large for his body. Examples of differences in hands and gigantism. It's like Andre the Giant's hand. And then this woman had acromegaly, and here are the pictures of her growing throughout her life. So from 9, she looks like a normal kid. 16, she looks like a normal teenager. But what happened after she was 20? Epiphyseal plates, yeah, they sealed shut. So she's a tall woman, but you can see that she didn't get any taller, but look what's happening to her face and her chin. It keeps growing. And then you can see her hands are just really huge. And her chin and forehead kept growing all through that time. Right. And then the last thing about growth hormone. So other hormones that are necessary for growth. I already mentioned thyroid hormone, and it's permissive. It allows growth hormone to work properly. Thyroid hormone is not just permissive on growth hormone, it's also permissive for epinephrine. So it has effects on the brain too. If you don't have enough thyroid hormone, growth hormone can't work on your muscles and bones, which cause you to be what? Short of stature, right? And it also doesn't allow your brain to develop properly, so what's going to be going on with you? mental retardation. So if a kid's tested early and they have inappropriate levels of thyroid hormone, like way low thyroid hormone, they can actually do what to fix that?
Thyroid replacement.
Thyroid replacement, yep. So they can take a thyroid hormone replacement. If they don't, there's nothing they can do with it. The mental retardation, the growth is irreversible if they don't correct it. Okay. Insulin helps with growth hormone in the fact that it tries to increase protein synthesis. How does it work against growth hormone, though? How does insulin work against growth hormone? What do you know insulin already does? It causes you to pull sugar out of your blood. What does growth hormone want to do? Put sugar in your blood. So they have some properties that they work together. They have a synergistic effect, but other times their work is what? Antagonists. And then the androgens and estrogens. Androgen means a masculinizing hormone. Estrogens mean feminizing hormones. So there are actually lots of different types of estrogens. There are different types of androgens. The one that you want to remember for androgen here is going to be what? Obviously, testosterone. What's interesting about testosterone and estrogen is that testosterone stimulates the growth spurt of your bones. It goes to the epiphyseal plate and causes them to start growing really, really quick. The weird thing is that around 20 or 21 years of age, it goes to the epiphyseal plate, and it's actually the same chemical that's responsible for shutting off the growth. So we're not exactly sure what the mechanism is there, but it stimulates rapid bone growth, and then it also inhibits future rapid bone growth, or future bone growth period. So it nurtures the epiphyseal plate, and then it seals it shut at the end of puberty. Okay, next. Posterior pituitary. The neurohypophysis. Hypophysis meant pituitary. What's this part telling you? It comes from the brain tissue. So where the other one, the anterior, came from Rathke's pouch, grew up from the mouth and up into the brain, this one actually grew from the brain and down. So it starts in the brain, starts growing down, and it actually implants itself down in the cribriform plate. So your pituitary is actually in the cribriform plate. If you, in anatomy, if you looked at sheep brains. Did you look at sheep brains here? Oh. So if you looked at sheep brains, or typically animal brains, if they pull the brain out quickly while they're processing the animal, they usually rip off the pituitary gland. Why? They don't mean to. It's because it's where? It's stuck inside of a bone. If you pull the brain out quickly, it just rips it off. If it's stuck inside of a bone, is there room for expansion in there? No. So things like tumors can actually have a very dramatic effect. Because a little tiny tumor around the pituitary gland can put a lot of pressure on it and cause a lot of problems. Okay, so posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis, where it's derived embryologically is from what tissue? Nervous tissue. Yep, so from the brain. I already pointed out the picture earlier, but the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary are connected by that neuro connection. So there's a line of what? What part of a neuron goes all the way down into the posterior pituitary? The axon. Yep. Axons extend down into the posterior pituitary. What makes the hormones? The hypothalamus. Hypothalamus makes the hormones. The posterior pituitary just does what with them? Stores and secretes. That's it. And then there are the two hormones. Vasopressin and oxytocin. What do you know the other name for vasopressin is? ADH. Right, and then I told you the name of the axons already, but the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei. All right, axons. These were the cell bodies, are the names of the cell bodies. So paraventricular was associated with which of those two? Vasopressin or oxytocin? Oxytocin. Yep. The O and the P are closely related, so that'll help you remember it. And then supraoptic releases vasopressin. All right. The cells that support, so I think, there we go. The cells that are down here that support these neurons are called pituocytes. So if they're supporting neurons, what's that fancy general name for supporting cells of neurons? Glia. They're actually a form of glia that we didn't talk about before. So these pituocytes are specialized glia that help nurture or take care of these terminals down here. Right, and then I already pointed this out like 4 times, so it must be important. Posterior pituitary doesn't actually make any hormones, it just stores them. So it stores them down here at the terminals. When the hypothalamus is ready to use it, it sends an electrical potential, an axon potential, Action, potential. Trying to mix 3 words and they kept screwing them up. So it sends an axon, sends an AP down the axon to the terminal and then causes the release. So it goes across the synapse. When it gets across the synapse, it goes into the blood. What is it now? It's a hormone, and it travels all through the body. Where's oxytocin go? Goes to the uterus. Yep, that was one place we talked about. Where do you know vasopressin is going to go? The nephron. What part of the nephron? So it goes to the nephron in the kidney and goes to the distal and collecting ducts. Yep, so distal tubule and the collecting ducts. What's it do? Makes you retain water. So which one's false about the posterior pituitary? How about number 1? Does the posterior pituitary store ACTH? So what are the 2 hormones the posterior pituitary stores? Vasopressin and oxytocin. Where's ACTH stored? In the anterior pituitary. So that was fast. All right. There's a neurological connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Is that true or false? That was true. Hypothalamus makes oxytocin and ADH. Yep, you already answered that one. And hormones released from the posterior pituitary are released into the blood. Yep. All right, the 2 hormones, vasopressin, ADH. You already know a lot about this. So the pathway, what stimulates the release of vasopressin, ADH? One thing you already know, because I made you memorize the pathway for the last test, is the RAAS, right? Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Which of those chemicals stimulates vasopressin release? Renin, angiotensin, or aldosterone? Angiotensin, right? So the angiotensin 2 is what stimulates the release of vasopressin. It goes to the hypothalamus. Remember, it stimulates the release of vasopressin. It also makes you very thirsty. And the big goal here, vasopressin helps you reabsorb water. And then the vaso part of it is also because it's a blood vessel constrictor. A third thing that they've figured out is that vasopressin is actually important in memory. They've just been learning that. So vasopressin helps increase memory to an extent. And this is kind of really weird, but vasopressin also is released after an orgasm in a male. Fun fact, yeah. So release of vasopressin is input from, and then here are the different factors. You already know the other one, the renin-angiotensin pathway, but hypothalamic osmoreceptors, what are these sensitive to? Water concentration. Yep. So they're sensitive to water concentration. Why would they release ADH? Think about it. If there's too much water or too little water in your body? If there's too little water. Right. Because if there's too little water, you release ADH, an antidiuretic, to help you retain water. Brings back up your water concentration. And then minor input from baroreceptors. Where do you find baroreceptors? There are only 2 places we've talked about them. Yep. Carotid sinus and the aortic arch. So what low signal or a high signal from a baroreceptor? Which one would trigger ADH release? So if you have high receptor activity, means you have high blood pressure, and you release ADH, what's going to happen to your blood pressure? It's going to make you keep water and do what with your blood pressure? Go higher. What kind of feedback loop would that be? That would be a fatal positive feedback loop. So having a drop in your blood pressure stimulates the hypothalamus to release ADH. ADH makes you retain water and does what to your blood pressure? Brings it back to normal. So now you have 3 inputs, or 3 stimuli. You have the RAAS, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. You have the hypothalamic osmoreceptors, and you have the baroreceptors. What happens if you break ADH? If you don't have enough ADH, ADH is antidiuretic. If you have it, you're in an antidiuretic state. If you can't make it, you become in a what state? A diuretic state, which means you're doing what? Tinkling a lot, right? So lots and lots of piddle. What's that look like? What other diseases does that look like that makes you urinate a lot? Diabetes mellitus. Yeah. So it looks like diabetes mellitus, but it's how it works totally different. What does diabetes mellitus revolve around? What hormone? Insulin. What chemical in your body other than insulin? Glucose, right. ADH, or diabetes insipidus, ADH deficiency, has nothing to do with insulin. It has nothing to do with sugar. So if you were to test the urine of somebody with ADH deficiency, diabetes insipidus, and taste test. Hopefully you're not taste testing the urine of. If you're testing the urine of somebody with diabetes mellitus, what might you find in diabetes mellitus that you definitely aren't going to find in insipidus? Glucose in the mellitus, not in the insipidus. They look the same in that they both have polyuria, lots of urine. They're losing lots of water, so what do they both have to worry about? Dehydration. So lots of urine and risk of dehydration in both situations. When you drink on a Friday or Saturday or noon on Mondays, if you drink too much, it starts shutting off neurons in your brain. One set of neurons is your hypothalamus. It starts affecting your freezing, feeding, fighting, and fornicating instincts. So that whole feeding instinct and the whole retention of water goes out the window because it shuts off the release of ADH. What state do you fall in? If you can't release ADH, you must fall into a diuretic state. What are you doing more frequently then? What do they call that? You broke what? You broke the seal. Yeah. And my friends used to tell me, oh, you know, it's because I'm drinking so much. And then when I started learning about physiology, it actually has nothing to do with, you know, drinking lots of fluids. It's because you're drinking lots of alcohol. It's shutting off the brain. If you were to measure how much you urinate out and how much liquid you actually take in, which one is going to be bigger? The output. So how do you feel the next day? Dehydrated. Yep, it makes your brain feel like a raisin in there because there's not enough water in your body. So ADH deficiency, you can get a self-inflicted ADH deficiency just by drinking too much alcohol. And then just the opposite, having too much of it. So what would happen to you if you had too much antidiuretic? What would happen to your urine production? It would shoot down, right? What's going to happen to you? You're going to retain lots and lots of water. What's going to happen to your blood volume? It's going to go up. What's going to happen to your blood pressure? It goes up. What's going to happen to, what's that other disorder where you're starting to leak lots of fluids into the tissue? Edema. And the next, oxytocin. Oxytocin is more commonly known as the cuddle chemical in layperson circles. So, oxytocin, the cuddle chemical, the reason they call it that is because most of the research on oxytocin revolves around its bonding effects. There are these little things called prairie voles. Well, number one is they find that almost all animals that mate for life have high levels of oxytocin. These little prairie vole things, they look like a cross between a rat and a mole. But they have lots and lots of oxytocin. One of the animals with the highest concentration of oxytocin, actually. If they have a litter of pups and you go to pick up the mom, she will hold on to all the pups at one time, and you pick them all up in one unit. If you turn off her oxytocin, so you give her a chemical that shuts off her oxytocin, she wants nothing to do with the pups. She'll go to the opposite side of the cage, and if one of the pups comes near her, she'll walk away from it. She just wants nothing to do with it. But oxytocin, they find that it causes cuddling between animals. So there are a couple times in life that this pops out, especially in women. So it starts at uterine contractions. Uterine contractions, when the baby's in there and ready to come out, start pushing on it, causes this contraction, sends a signal up to the brain going, ow, 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 and then it causes the release of oxytocin. My only justification, and I don't know this because I'm not an evolutionary scientist type of person, but my idea with why this happens is that there's got to be some plan for why some little thing that weighs 7 to 9 pounds that caused more pain in this woman's life than she will ever know in the rest of her life or ever has known, that when that thing comes out of her, she goes, oh, gimme. Right? And it's got to be because of the oxytocin. When the oxytocin piles up in her body because of those uterine contractions, this chemical is making her squeeze her uterus and push this baby out. So it's making her push, 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 but at the same time in her mind it's giving her this happier feeling, this more cuddly, loving feeling. And that's another reason they call it the cuddle chemical. So it aids in uterine contraction, helps with childbirth, and it helps that instinct of her wanting to be close to the baby.
Is that related to postpartum? You don't have
it can have some links, but another thing that's related to postpartum is the dopamine, which is actually prolactin inhibiting. That's me. That's really loud. So that prolactin inhibiting substance. So I just wanted to pull off something so it didn't vibrate anymore. But that's dopamine. The next one promotes ejection of the milk. So once this stuff's high in her blood, it's going to stimulate the first release of breast milk. So when the baby's born, she's going to start releasing breast milk. When the baby attaches to the nipple, it also sends a neural signal up to the hypothalamus that says release the oxytocin. So it flows back down. When she's breastfeeding and it's releasing oxytocin, other than the breast, what other organ is it affecting?
Uterus.
The uterus. Why would it be a good thing for her to breastfeed after childbirth? Well, it's going to be high in oxytocin, you're right, for the placenta. It's already high in oxytocin, so she's going to still have some contractions after the baby's born, but they're going to start dropping down in intensity until the placenta's born. Placenta's delivered. Oh, look, it's a placenta. What color do you buy for a placenta? It's not pink or blue. Some countries, they make soup out of that, don't they? Yeah. So maybe you buy celery for the placenta. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, every time that she releases oxytocin for breastfeeding, it stimulates small uterine contractions, and the uterus starts squeezing a little bit tighter and tighter, trying to do what with the uterus? Shrink it back down to size, because if it stays stretched out, it could actually prolapse, which means that it could fold over on itself and cause problems, or it can push out of the vagina, or it can actually push back into the rectum and push its way out. See the fun things you learn in pathophysiology? So always save those for the last week of class because it gets a lot of Okay, so promotes ejection of the milk, and then, of course, it stimulates uterine contractions. What's interesting is that the other time in life that oxytocin cranks out is after orgasm. So it causes uterine contractions after orgasm and gives her a cuddly feeling. Men don't release the oxytocin like women do. We release that vasopressin stuff that goes, man, I really wish I could pee, but I can't. I don't know. I don't really know the effect. But vasopressin stimulates memory, so maybe we'll remember better, I guess. I don't know. I'm shooting for reasons why we release vasopressin and not oxytocin. But it definitely explains why we don't cuddle. So it's not our fault. Sorry. Okay, and then I already talked about this whole pathway. What kind of feedback loop is that if contraction releases oxytocin and oxytocin causes more contraction, it releases more oxytocin? It's a positive feedback loop. The end of that section. So what's due by the next time we come in? Yep, we're going to get started with the peripheral, but I'm just going to write it down on here. So the time we meet, it's was this number 11?
Yes.
Yeah, online quiz 11. Is it not showing? It's not showing? I'll have to upload it tonight. 11. It's not very big. The presentations I can put up, but I really like for you to actually do them on your own because they're only about 4 or 5 pictures. Otherwise, the rest are in your notes. What is today's date? 29th? Woohoo! I got a new phone coming in the mail today. I'm excited. Too bad I'm not there to get it. Okay, let's do that next one. And I'm just going to keep the recording going like this. So peripheral, what did we just get done talking about? Central, which means that the organs we just talked about revolve around where? The brain. Yep. So peripheral means that they're outside the brain and spinal cord. The first one's going to be the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is really important to know because are there very many people out there with thyroid dysfunction? There are a ton of people out there with thyroid dysfunction. And it keeps raising. There are a lot of theories why. Like, does it have to do with iodine levels? You know, because it used to be mandated that we had to put iodine in our salt. But now, because of all the health freaks out there, they're like, we don't want anything artificial. So you can buy sea salt that doesn't have iodine. Is that a great idea? No. Not unless you're supplementing somewhere else with iodine. Because what could it cause, not getting enough iodine? You could start growing a second head out of your neck, right? What do they call that thing? A goiter, yeah, it can cause a goiter. So it's not very fun. Oh, this is really weird because the screen here is a totally different color. I can see my glasses have this purple reflection and the screen is blue and it's just really weird. But the anatomy, you know where the thyroid gland is, right? Where? Yep, it's up here in the neck. It looks like a little bow tie in there. Right, what are the little things in the back of the thyroid gland called? Parathyroids, right. So the thyroid's like a little bow tie in there. The thyroid cells that you want to get familiar with are called follicular cells. So when you break it down and you look under a microscope, and you probably did this in anatomy, you look at the follicles and you can identify the little follicular cells. The follicular cells are the ones that release this this T3 and T4 thyroid hormone. I'm pointing that out because there are other cells in there too that release something totally different. So the anatomy is that the thyroid gland's in the neck. It's set up with a series of follicles, and inside those follicles you have things called follicular cells. The follicular cells actually form a ring, and the ring is filled with something called colloid. So that colloid's full of it's basically a carbohydrate protein molecule called thyroglobulin. It's just a brief pathway. And then from that thyroglobulin, this is the precursor to make T3 and T4. So you already know thyroid hormone is made from what amino acid is its starting point? Close. It started with T. Yeah, it's tyrosine. So it's made from tyrosine. You start accumulating this tyrosine, you start manipulating it, and you turn it into the thyroglobulin. And then what's going to happen is you have to tag it. It has to be tagged with a special mineral. What's the mineral that I just mentioned that
Iodine.
we have a problem getting sometimes? Iodine. All right. So you have to tag it with iodine. When you get enough pieces of iodine on it, you can release it. If you only get one piece of iodine on it, you can't release it from the thyroid. It's stuck there. It can be stored in that way. When you get the second piece of iodine, it's still stuck there. It can be stored that way. As soon as you tag a third piece of iodine on, now it's called triiodothyronine. Tri means what? 3. Iodo is referring to what? Iodines, and thyrionine is talking about that thyroid molecule. So triiodothyronine is T3. You could release that stuff. But a lot of times what your thyroid will do is tag an extra one on there just in case. So instead of stopping at 3, you can tag a fourth one on, and they call it tetraiodothyronine. And tetraiodothyronine is referred to as thyroxine. What you need to remember about this, when you release these two, you release them both simultaneously, but not in the same proportion. You release about 10 times as much T4 as you do T3. That's the first thing you need to remember. The second thing you need to remember is that the T3 is the more active form. T3 is the one that does the most activity in your body. What's it going to do? What activity am I trying to increase your metabolism? Right. So these two things get released in the body. First is T4, and they could get turned into T3. What does it have to do to T4 to turn into T3? Take a guess. It just has to pluck an iodine off. So I always use that analogy of a grenade with the safety pin in. That's pretty much what it is. The tetraiodothyronine, the T4, is like a grenade. It's not completely active yet. You have to pull the pin. Once you pull one of those iodines off, boom, it's triiodothyronine. That's the most active form. Right. And then the other set of cells in the anatomy are the C cells. And the C cells are easy to remember because they contain a C hormone, which is calcitonin. Calcitonin, guess what mineral it affects in your body? Calcium. Yep. So calcitonin lowers blood calcium. Its job is to lower blood calcium. Where would be a good place to store that calcium? On the bones. I always remember calcitonin tones my bones with calcium. What's that telling me? Is it building up the bones or tearing them down? Building them up. When you tone something, you build it stronger and more toned. So calcitonin tones your bones. It makes them stronger by stealing calcium from the blood and sticking it on the bone. And we're going to talk about calcitonin in more detail later. There's your thyroid. And then, like I said, on the back of this, there are four little points called the parathyroids. If you look at a slide, here you can see that colloid. This whole thing is the follicle coming all the way around. The colloid's the goo on the inside, full of thyroglobulin. And then the follicular cells themselves are the lining that form that circle. They go all the way around. All right. So synthesis, how it's made, and I already kind of walked you through it. It starts with what amino acid? Tyrosine. And then it gets turned into thyroglobulin, which can be stored. And then what do you slowly start sticking on the thyroglobulin? Iodines. Yep. So you can actually store this stuff by not turning it into its final version. The other trick to remember is this is that one exception to the rule. All of the hydrophobic hormones are made out of steroids except this one. What's this one made out of? An amino acid. This is the amine group that's made out of tyrosine. But it's still hydrophobic. Another property about this, which makes it special, it's hydrophobic, but it can actually be stored. You store it by not turning it into the final form. Unfortunately, if you don't get enough iodine, can you ever turn it into its final form? Nope. Remember, you have to have 3 or 4 iodine stuck on it to make it its final form or release it in the blood. So if you just keep accumulating this thyroglobulin and you don't have enough iodine, what happens? You just keep making more thyroglobulin. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and cause a what? A goiter. Yep. So here's the process. Over here in the colloid, like I said, you start with the thyroglobulins. So the thyroglobulin starts here. You start tacking on what? Iodines. So this is just thyroglobulin, no iodine. When you tack one iodine on, here's your iodine, it turns into monoiodothyronine. Mono means 1. And then you tack another iodine on it, turns it into diiodothyronine, which means 2. This is kind of cool how this works. It doesn't just tack a third one on. What it does is it takes a diiodothyronine and sticks it to a mono, which makes a what? A tri. And then it takes that tri, pushes it over here, and it starts pushing it along and stores it until it's ready to release this group. So now it's going to take a couple of those diiodos, stick them together. 2 diiodos make a what? A 4, a tetra. So now I'm accumulating those too. And I'm going to push them along as they get closer and closer to pushing it to the blood. This follicular cell does an evaluation that says, wait a minute, you guys don't have enough iodine to leave, and so it separates them. It pushes the T3 and T4 out, and it recycles the mono and the di. So it pulls their iodines off, and then returns the iodine back out here and starts over from scratch. It's kind of a cool process. Which one of these is more active, T3 or T4? T3. Which one's more abundant? T4. And then I already told you this. So about 90% of the secretory product is released as T4, but T3 is the more active one. So if you're making those flow charts, you want to think of the hypothalamus at the very beginning. Put a little arrow coming down that had TRH next to it. TRH goes to the anterior pituitary and releases what hormone from the anterior pituitary? TSH. Remember, this is still central. And then the TSH goes to where? Thyroid, and does what to it? Stimulates it, hence the thyroid stimulating hormone name. When it gets down to the thyroid, it's going to crank out T3 and T4. This is what starts the whole ball rolling. So these are the stimuli that trigger the hypothalamus to turn on the pathway. Okay? The first thing is homeostasis. So the thyroid hormone level, your hypothalamus is always monitoring and saying, do we have 100% concentration of this thyroid hormone? If we have too much, what's the hypothalamus going to think? Shut off. Yep, it shuts it off. And then you slowly start burning up your thyroid, and when it gets too low, what's the hypothalamus think? Turn it back on, turns the pathway on. So you always want to keep it at 100% level. So if you take artificial T3 or T4, what's going to happen to your hypothalamus? It starts turning down. Yep. So, which is kind of a sucky loop, right? Because if you're taking the T3 and T4, you're probably not making enough in the first place, but what's going to happen to you? It's just going to turn lower. Yep. Right. Second, a calorogenic effect. The real word calorie in science means heat. So a heat-generating effect. If your body gets too, what? Cold, it turns on the pathway. So a colder temperature turns on the hypothalamus. Its overall effect, its final effect is to warm up the body by doing what to your metabolism? Raising the metabolism. And this intermediary metabolism, this is talking about what it does to carbs, fats, and proteins. So if you're trying to generate heat and you're trying to burn energy, what are you going to do to your fat? You're going to break it down. So it has a catabolic or destructive effect on your adipose tissue. What's it going to do to your glycogen stores? Break them down. It's trying to burn everything for heat and energy. What's it going to do to your proteins? Break them down. It's trying to burn everything for heat. So what happens to the size of these people that have too much thyroid in their body? Too much thyroid hormone? They get skinnier. They get scrawnier in general. Muscle mass starts getting smaller. Their adipose cells start getting smaller. So I always think of the thyroid hormone, if it's trying to keep you warm and that's its main goal, if your house is freezing and you're freezing to death, what are you going to throw in the fire? Everything. Everything goes. It's fire sale, right? So you're throwing everything in. You're throwing your chairs, your table, everything. That's what the thyroid's doing to the body. If you have too much thyroid hormone, it's burning your sugars, it's burning your fats, it's burning your proteins, it's trying to save your life. The next effect it has is called sympathomimetic. What's mimicking mean? To act like something, right? So sympatho, what's it acting like? The sympathetic nervous system. What's it going to do to this person's anxiety levels? Lower them or raise them? Raise them. What's it going to do to their blood pressure? Raise them. What's it going to do to their pupils? Dilate them. All the things you already know about the sympathetic nervous system, this is actually helping increase the activity of epinephrine. So the thyroid hormone itself doesn't cause this person to sweat or get anxious or anxiety. It's the combination of the thyroid and epinephrine. Thyroid's like fire on the or fuel on the fire. If somebody already has high thyroid, they can be relaxed, calm, their blood pressure's fine. Boom!
Oh my.
But as soon as something scares them and they release that little bit of epinephrine, what happens? Their epinephrine plus the thyroid is explosive. Just testing to see how many people have hyperthyroidism. But yeah, you take these people to a scary movie, the first time that somebody jumps out from a closet, they're like sweating and they're climbing over the chair. Like, God, I can't believe I came into this. I can't handle this. And then you're like, shit, right? Calm down. But it has a sympathomimetic effect. It turns up the effects of epinephrine. So a little bit of epinephrine goes a long, long way in these people. Right, next effect. People are still like moving, going, oh my God. Effect on the cardiovascular system increases the heart rate. You already know this. If it's sympathomimetic, what's it going to do to your heart rate? Increase it. What's it going to do to your blood pressure? What's it going to do to your sweating? Right. I see people going, God. Exactly. Airing out the armpits. Thank you. I guess I'm not worried about it. Two people next to you have to worry about it. So, and then effect on growth and nervous system. I already told you, thyroid hormone does what for growth hormone? Antagonist, permissive, or synergistic? It's permissive. It allows growth hormone to work. So if you don't have enough thyroid hormone but you have plenty of growth hormone, what happens to your stature as a kid? You don't grow. Yeah. And I think that's where we're stopping for today. The sign-in sheet's floating around somewhere. Anybody know where it's at? Did it make it to a back corner? Great.